When you think of the Indian Wars, your mind probably jumps to scenes from old westerns, right? These big mythologized tales of cowboys and cavalry charges. But the real story, well, it's so much more complex and, frankly, more impactful than that mythology would have us believe. So, okay, let's dive in and deconstruct that myth.
See, the thing is, the Indian Wars weren't just a string of disconnected battles. As the source material makes really clear, they were a long, drawn-out clash of entire worlds. The real fight wasn't about cowboys versus Indians. It was driven by the relentless push of American settlement, the laying of thousands of miles of railroad tracks, and an insatiable hunger for resources. All of this just smashed right into the traditional ways of life for Native nations. Thomas Jefferson's old idea of having separate, isolated nations out west, yeah, that became completely impossible. So for this explainer, we're going to walk through 5 key phases to really get a handle on this. We'll start with that initial clash of worlds, then get into the wars and massacres, take a look at the government's so-called peace policy, cover the incredible resistance on the plains, and finally, see how the plains were ultimately pacified.
All right, let's set the stage here. The time right after the American Civil War. This was a massive turning point. The nation was back together, and the U.S. government pretty much turned its full attention and power westward, really ramping up its efforts to move Native Americans onto reservations.
So what's really key to understand here is that the U.S. wasn't just reacting to things as they happened. No, it was actively pushing a policy of confinement. And to do it, they brought in the big guns, celebrated Civil War generals like William Sherman and Philip Sheridan. These guys took the total war tactics they'd perfected in the South and applied them out west. They would take small, local conflicts, which were often started by illegal settlers in the first place, and blow them up into full-scale wars. And on the other side, you had Native Americans fighting, literally, for their survival and their entire way of life. Well, with that kind of immense pressure, violence was pretty much inevitable. So next up, we're going to see how these tensions just exploded into open warfare and some truly brutal massacres, starting up in Minnesota.
Okay, just look at the speed of this change. It's incredible. In only 8 years, the white settler population in Minnesota skyrockets from just 6,000 to over 150,000. That is an absolute flood of people. This illegal influx completely overran the Dakota Nation. Hunting grounds vanished. And to make matters worse, federal agents started holding back food they had promised, pushing the Dakota people right to the edge of starvation.
And that breaking point, it came with words like these. When a trader named Andrew Myrick allegedly spat this out to the starving Dakota, it just perfectly captured the absolute contempt they were facing. Not long after, 4 young Dakota men killed 5 white settlers. Knowing that retaliation was coming, the tribe chose to go to war. Myrick, by the way, was later found with his mouth stuffed full of grass. The U.S. response to the Dakota War was swift and incredibly harsh. Military tribunals sentenced 303 men to death. Now, President Lincoln did step in and commute most of those sentences, but he still approved the execution of 38 Dakota men. It was, and still is, the single largest mass execution in all of American history. And this wasn't an isolated incident. A very similar, tragic story was unfolding down in Colorado. A gold rush in 1858 brought about 100,000 prospectors flooding onto Cheyenne lands. The local newspapers were stoking paranoia, and a militia leader, a guy named John Chivington, started calling for war, promising everyone it would be a quick and easy victory. And this is the horrific result. The Cheyenne chief, Black Kettle, was actively trying to make peace. He had literally traveled to Denver to talk and was following the government's instructions to the letter. But on November 29, 1864, Chivington's militia attacked his camp at Sand Creek anyway. They slaughtered around 200 people, most of them women and children. The Sand Creek Massacre became this huge national scandal, a truly brutal symbol of the violence out on the frontier. Now, in response to scandals like Sand Creek, there was a big push from the American public and from Congress for a different approach. And this led to a new official government strategy, something they called the peace policy. So the idea was, okay, let's replace military force with something else. Congress set up this Indian Peace Commission, and then they basically handed over control of the entire reservation system to Protestant churches. The thinking was that maybe religious men could succeed where the soldiers had failed, that they could persuade Native Americans to assimilate into American culture. So, you could call it a peace policy, but really, it was more of a religious policy. It was basically a strategy of cultural warfare. And this right here, this shows you exactly what assimilation looked like in practice.
This is Tom Torlino of the Navajo Nation. The picture on the left, that's from 1882, when he first got to a government boarding school. The one on the right is from just 3 years later. The goal was to systematically strip away every part of indigenous culture, their language, their religion, their family structures, even their gender roles, and just replace it all with the American ideal. But underneath this supposedly kind humanitarian effort was this really deep-seated prejudice. This quote from a U.S. agent in 1875 just pulls back the curtain on the whole thing. He saw the people he was supposed to be helping as lazy and inferior. He truly believed they had to be forced to change, for their own good. It's an incredibly paternalistic and condescending worldview. But of course, this wasn't a one-sided story. Many Native nations absolutely refused to accept this policy of forced assimilation. The great powers of the plains, like the Comanche and the Sioux, kept fighting for their freedom, and that led to some of the most famous conflicts of the entire era. Down in the southern plains, the Comanche were a seriously dominant force. But after the Civil War, the U.S. military was able to refocus its efforts. When the famous war leader Quanah Parker kept leading raids from reservation lands, the Army basically drew a line in the sand. They issued an ultimatum: get on the reservation by the fall of 1874, or you will be considered hostile. And that's what kicked off the Red River War, which ended with the defeat of the last free Comanche bands. Meanwhile, on the northern plains, the path to war was just as clear-cut. In 1868, the Treaty of Fort Laramie was supposed to guarantee the Great Sioux Reservation, which included their sacred Black Hills. But then, in 1874, gold was discovered there. And just like that, the treaty was completely ignored. Prospectors flooded in, the government tried to force the Sioux to sell, and when they refused, well, that's when the troops were sent in. And all of this leads directly to the most legendary battle of the Indian Wars. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and his 7th Cavalry were sent to deal with the Sioux. But here's what Custer had no way of knowing. The spiritual leader, Sitting Bull, had had powerful visions of a great victory, and these visions inspired thousands of warriors from all different bands, even from bands who had signed treaties, to come together in this one massive village along the Little Bighorn River. He had absolutely no idea what he was walking into. Custer was completely, hopelessly outnumbered. His forces were just swallowed up. He and all 268 of his men were killed. Now, in the United States, Custer's last stand became this huge rallying cry for revenge. But for the nations of the plains, it was their greatest, most triumphant victory. But here's the tragic irony of the whole thing. That stunning victory, it would actually seal their fate. The American response to Custer's defeat was going to be swift, overwhelming, and absolutely final. The news of Custer's fall just electrified the American public, and it unleashed the full, unrestrained might of the U.S. military. The Sioux bands were broken apart and hunted relentlessly through a long, starving winter. One by one, their incredible leaders were forced to give up. The great war leader Crazy Horse surrendered in 1877. And then finally, in July of 1881, Sitting Bull and the very last of his followers laid down their weapons. That was it. That was the end of organized Native resistance on the Great Plains. So, the United States had pacified the plains. They had achieved their goal. But let's be honest, that word, pacified, it's really just a nice-sounding word for conquest, isn't it? It was a military and a cultural takeover dressed up in the language of peace. And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. What's the real story that a word like pacified is trying to cover up?